Hello everyone and welcome back to Mossy Bottom. I've lived on a smallholding or homestead now for over 5 years, here in the west of Ireland, and I grew up in the country. But in between, I lived in cities for over a decade. And this video is for anyone who is curious what the standout differences are between life in a city and on a homestead like this. I've prepared a list of 10, some of them will be quite obvious to you, others I certainly didn't anticipate before moving here, so you might be quite surprised. As always, this is from my own perspective, living partially off-grid, surrounded by fields and forestry, growing about 60% of what I eat, keeping pigs, chickens, ducks, rabbits, tapping into a spring for water, using solar panels and coppicing my own trees for fuel. My nearest neighbour is 1 kilometre away, unless of course you count the mooing or barking kind. Okay folks, let's jump right in. So the first difference on my list is connectedness to the seasons, spring, summer, autumn and winter. And in case you're wondering, it's November right now, so we're fast approaching the winter here in Ireland. Of course, when I lived in a city, I was aware of the changing seasons. It might get a bit colder, I'd have to put a thicker coat on, don a pair of gloves and a scarf. The trees in the park would either be bare or in leaf. There'd be a smell of cut grass in the summer and the occasional lawnmower buzzing away in the background. Or I might see my breath on the air if it was winter and need to walk carefully across icy puddles. Living on a homestead, as I do, in which you're growing food, keeping animals, living as self-sufficiently as you can, means that your whole life is really dictated to by those seasons. In a city, how the world looks and feels subtly changes from one season to the next. But on a homestead in the country, everything that you do and how you live is completely different from one month to the next. In March, I'm planting seeds and preparing beds. In April, I'm planting potatoes and incubating eggs. In May, I'm picking dandelions and tending to newborn lives. In September, I'm harvesting those same potatoes that I planted in April, and I'm canning produce. In October, I'm covering the ground and preparing for the winter. I could give you an entirely different list of jobs for each and every month of the year, as could anyone living as I do, I'm sure. In a city, the seasons blend into one another. Nature doesn't dictate how we live, rather our jobs and families and responsibilities do. Nature has been relegated to something that we see and feel but aren't controlled by. Living as I do, there's a real sense of connectedness to nature and the seasons. I love having to wait for things like a harvest. I love anticipating things like planting seeds again in the spring, or splitting logs in the winter, or putting extra blankets on my bed because I have no central heating. For me, living in a city, it dulled that connectedness to nature, which has now become truly my master, which is humbling. I think that sense of connectedness to nature is how we've evolved to live, and that perhaps is why for many people, myself included, life in a city or suburb feels so alien, like we're actors performing on a stage, rather than really fulfilling our instincts. But with the joys of spring also come the lows of autumn. I think here in Ireland there is definitely seasonal depression around this time of year. I see it in my farming neighbours, and sometimes I even feel it a bit myself. When you're so connected to the seasons, life feels like a bit of a roller coaster as nature changes from growth and birth to decline and death, like at this time of year. But then, for every low, there's a new high just around the corner to get excited about. On the subject of nature, this video is sponsored by Wren, a company which you may not have heard of, but which I was delighted to be contacted by because it gives me the chance to promote ways that every one of us as individuals can combat climate change. Wren is a website that allows you to calculate your own carbon footprint, and you might be interested to compare the result to mine. If it's low, I'll be very impressed. and then offset that carbon footprint through a monthly payment which funds carbon reduction projects around the world, like mineral weathering on degraded land in Scotland, in which basalt rock is used to turn carbonic acid from rainfall into calcium carbonate in the soil on which trees are then planted. And the best thing is that they're using woolly pigs to prepare the land for planting. I think Mangalitsa pigs are perhaps the only breed even cooler than my Kuni Kunis. What I think makes Wren stand out is how transparent they are. Every project is monitored, providing satellite imagery, measuring tree trunks and quantifying the impact that your money is having. They're also a public benefit corporation, which means they have to be transparent about where your money is going. Just take a look at their FAQ. They even release a financial report each year of their spending. Climate change is a real thing affecting all of us, including me here in the west of Ireland. What it means for people living in this area is more rain, which degrades the soil quality, more extreme weather events like winter storms and summer droughts, which just a few years ago decimated the Irish potato crop, and even the potential for parts of the country to become permanently submerged. That's predicted by the year 2050. It is not just numbers on a page. My farming neighbours in their 60s and 70s have all told me how the climate here has changed drastically since they were young. So if you are in a position to do something about it, please do. Finally, if you want to find out more, then follow the link to Wren's website down in the description. The first 100 people who sign up will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. Number 2 on my list is anonymity. And this may surprise you because if you've only lived in a city, you may think that moving to a homestead here in the country is a way to disappear off the edge of the map. But that isn't what I found. When I lived in cities in my 20s, it was very easy to be anonymous. And for an introvert like me, that came naturally. It was often the case that I didn't even know the name of my next door neighbour. And this was on a row of terraced houses. But on a smallholding, I know almost all my neighbours, even though the nearest is a kilometre away from me, and most of them know me too. I think in the country, communities are smaller, there are less people, and so you stand out more. And the way you live becomes your identity to local people. In a city, you're just someone that walks in and out of a front door. Now, whether that's good or bad really depends on your perspective and what you want from life. Third on my list of differences between life in a city and on a homestead like mine is one of the most obvious, and that's physical work. Living this type of life, you have to enjoy being constantly moving and on the go. You can't really have days off when there are animals to feed and clean and gaps in the rain to take advantage of. You know, repairing that fence, weeding that bed, splitting that firewood. I've always been very physically active long before I moved here. When I lived in cities, I would go for runs, and I was also an avid rock climber. Every week, I'd go multiple times if I could to my local climbing gym. But if I ever felt under the weather or particularly tired or was just distracted by something else, it was so easy to just have a day or a week off. I can't do that here. But the interesting thing, in spite of often feeling exhausted, achy and injured, I have to say, this year I damaged my back and had to go have an MRI scan. Thankfully it's nothing too serious. In spite of all that, the physical work here doesn't feel to me like work. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that I'm working for myself, to my own rhythm and schedule, on the projects and activities which I want to do. And it all contributes to this little world that I'm creating. If that prospect excites you too, then I don't think any amount of aches and pains will really matter to you. Of course, much of the physical work is repetitive. Digging, weeding, clearing, moving. But there are many advantages to being that active. In general, my health and fitness levels are much higher. I sleep much better and don't suffer from insomnia, which was a part of my life living in cities in my 20s. And I think daily physical activity is really good for mental health too, which we probably all need. At number 4 on my list is the passage of time. And I have to admit, this might be something which has more to do with being happy than living on a homestead rather than a city. But since moving here, time definitely seems to be passing much more quickly. I think part of that also has to do with being so closely connected to the seasons, as I mentioned. I remember when I lived in a city, the months melded into each other, and I didn't have the same awareness of time passing that I have now. There was a sort of unlimitedness about time, because the world around me, it wasn't constantly changing. I have spoken to other people who say the same thing after moving into nature from an urban environment. I think in the city, time is something which you occupy in order to survive, whereas on a smallholding, it's something which you're always trying not to run out of. Fifth on my list is something I contemplated not admitting in this video, because frankly, it is a bit embarrassing, but that's personal hygiene. When I lived in cities, and even growing up in the country surrounded by people, I always brushed my teeth twice a day, showered at least daily. I ironed my clothes, believe it or not. You wouldn't know now, would you? I wore deodorant. Whereas here on my small holding, surrounded as I am by plants and pigs and old nature rather than people, the routine of personal hygiene just goes out the window. Now don't get me wrong folks, I do still brush my teeth and take showers, but it doesn't have the same importance that it once did. People judge you, nature and animals don't. They just want feeding and don't really care how bad you smell as long as you meet their needs. I think what it really comes down to is a realization that those things aren't nearly as important as you once thought they were. And that's a great feeling because you become more aware of your environment and less aware of yourself. Number 6 is another practical one, and that's access to amenities. I talked about climbing. Well, there are no climbing gyms out here in rural Ireland. The nearest adult climbing gym that I'm aware of is in Dublin, which is a 3-hour drive from me. And of course, climbing is quite a niche interest, but even things like cafes, cinemas, bakeries, restaurants, pubs and clubs are all quite a significant drive away from me. And I've also lived in apartments on high streets. I spent 2 years living in Versailles in France, and I was on a street called Rue de la Paroisse in a tiny bedsit on the 3rd floor. And beneath me on the street were clothes shops and patisseries, newsagents, cafes, boulangeries. I barely had to walk out of my front door, and there were things that I could buy and do everywhere around me. The nearest city to me here is Sligo, which is about an hour away by car. Galway to the south is about an hour and a half. And of course, there are lots of small towns between here and the cities, but they're much smaller with a different atmosphere and far less amenities. Now to me, that is not a bad thing. I can honestly say climbing gyms are the only thing that I miss, which says a lot about me, doesn't it? And one day, I hope to build my own climbing gym, by the way. I've decided, at least a climbing wall, maybe not a gym. But to you, not having those other amenities and facilities and means of human interaction right there on your doorstep might make you feel isolated. Then again, perhaps like me, feeling isolated is kind of what you like. It really depends on who you are as a person. Seventh on my list of differences between a city or urban life and life on a homestead like mine is wildlife. Not this kind of wildlife. And I actually debated whether to include this because I am very aware that wildlife finds its way into cities all around the world as well. I've seen urban foxes on visits to Edinburgh at 5 a.m. and I've heard owls hooting in the Bristol suburbs when I lived there for a time. But it's different out on a rural smallholding. Encounters with wildlife are really a daily occurrence, and because you're spending so much time outside, they become part of the very fabric of your life. I know multiple robin redbreasts in my garden by territory. They hang out in particular spots, and I give them names. Don't ask. I see badgers, I see red squirrels in the forest, wild rabbits constantly, even pine martens occasionally on my walks. Mice and other rodents live all around me, as do countless species of birds. It's November and you can still hear them singing all around me now. A day really doesn't go by when I don't have some kind of encounter with wildlife, and this is rural Ireland. In a city, such encounters are special and quite rare. Well, maybe not with rats, depending on which city you live in, but you know what I mean. If you live in nature, then you live with nature too. At number 8, we have a difference that really comes with the lifestyle rather than the location, and that's self-discipline. On a small holding like mine, you set your own schedule. You wake when you want to. Well, that's not true. You wake when the one creature or another wakes you up by howling or oinking. But you do work when you want to work, you take breaks when you want to take breaks, you stop when you want to, and there is never anyone watching you or checking up on you or telling you what to do and how to do it. You know how prisoners often talk about becoming institutionalized? Well, I think life on a homestead is about as opposite to that as life can get. You have almost complete freedom and self-control. And the flip side of that is that you have to be very self-disciplined. And that's something which is usually quite easy to begin with during that honeymoon period. But during the second, the third, the fourth winter, when the land is flooded or covered in snow and you have to go out and freeze your fingers off repairing something which you thought you'd already done, it can be a different matter entirely. And I occasionally see comments on my channel saying that I don't represent that side of life here, which I think is unfair because I do often talk about the negatives. But the fact is, I'm really happy in my life and have found a sense of fulfillment that I just never had living in cities, working conventional jobs, and I tried it for a decade. So my perspective reflects that. But make no mistake, folks, this is not paradise, and anyone who tells themselves that it is probably won't last very long. In a mainstream job, if you don't show up to work enough times at least, you'll get fired and then you won't be able to pay the mortgage. There's an imperative every day to keep going. But out here, the only imperative is your own internal motivation and of course a sense of responsibility to your animals. But believe me, to the right person, those things can be incredibly motivating. It just depends on what makes you tick. But in a city, I definitely always felt like a cog in the machine. Here, I'm driving the tractor. And if I don't drive it, no one will. And if it breaks down, okay, enough metaphors for one video. Ninth on my list is the weather, and you can see today just how changeable it is. Sunny one minute, cloudy the next, it's forecast to rain later today. Now of course, the weather gods don't make exceptions for cities when it comes to extreme weather events, and we've all seen in the news how urban areas can be devastated by hurricanes, flooding, and conversely, of course, by heat waves too in certain parts of the world. I think the biggest difference is your sense of vulnerability living, as I do, a kilometre from your nearest neighbour. In February 2018, just a year and a half after I moved here to my small holding, the beast from the east struck Ireland. A huge polar storm blowing in from the direction of Scandinavia. I remember it so well. And because it was the dead of winter, I was actually in town at the time doing my washing in an outside laundrette. And I then had to drive home, and I remember trees literally blowing down in front of me on the road and my car vibrating and shaking as I drove. When I got back here to my caravan, by some miracle it hadn't been flipped, but the contents of every shelf was on the floor, and my first greenhouse was in pieces scattered over the neighbouring fields. There was nowhere to escape it, and I was by myself. I did have this one, of course, Moss, who was skipping around, chasing leaves as if it was a sunny day in the middle of June. I've also been snowed in a couple of times here, and Ireland isn't known for snow, but we usually do get a week or two in the winter. And when heavy snow freezes and turns into ice, it can make the small lane to my cottage and land impassable for several days. Trees have been blown down on that lane too, which, if I hadn't gone out with my chainsaw in the dead of winter, would have stayed there for a long time because other people simply don't use that road. There is a real sense that you need to have provisions for such events living on a smallholding or homestead, and in a way, that's actually quite a nice feeling, sort of like being part of a disaster movie in which you're the safe one. Storms in particular are vicious in the west of Ireland, and I think in the decades to come, sadly, that can only get worse. Finally, number 10 on my list of differences between life in a city and on a smallholding like mine is a difference in energy. And if that sounds a bit cryptic, then let me try to explain. Nature here is busier, it's more vibrant, the seasons are more visible, there's more life, there's more natural energy. In a city, when I lived there for 10 years, there's human energy everywhere you turn. You feel like you're part of something, a single bee in a hive of thousands. It's the same energy that makes being in a busy restaurant that much more enjoyable than being in an empty one. And we've all been in both and know the difference in feeling. And that human energy, it just doesn't exist out here. And some people, I think, can't live without that. Others, like me, are desperate to escape it. The energy of nature is different. On the whole, it's quieter and requires, I suppose, a curiosity to enjoy. It's often subtle, but it's no less addictive once you allow it into your life. For many people, I think the human energy of a city is the home they want to be part of, and the quiet, contemplative energy of nature is the holiday or vacation they want to go on to unwind and de-stress. For me, I think it's the other way round, and I do like visiting cities occasionally. And if you're that way too, you might just enjoy living on a homestead as much as I do. Okay folks, that is just about it for this video. I seem to have found myself with a kitten on my lap once again. I hope that if you are contemplating a move to a smallholding or a homestead like mine, or going off-grid, wherever you live in the world, this isn't just about Ireland specifically, then you might have found this comparison useful. There are so many videos like this on my channel, including moving to Ireland, the best and worst things, which if you enjoyed this one, I think you will enjoy too. And remember, if you are a fan of the channel, then don't just subscribe, but also hit that bell icon next to the subscribe button, because otherwise YouTube will not add new videos which I create to your watch page. And I don't release many videos, just 2 or 3 per month, so I just don't have enough time, frankly, so they are easy to miss if you don't hit that bell, so please do. Thank you as always for watching and supporting the content that I produce here at Mossy Bottom. From me, from my many critters, to you wherever you are in the world, take care and bye for now.
Born in a Quaker town where folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day." When the sun rose low, back to work they'd go, singing on their way. For job and home to call our own, we'll work as another